Hello everybody, and a happy Tuesday lunchtime to you all. I very much enjoyed the inaugural playing of Taylor Swift for the opening of A Thinking. I hope you did too. My name, I can see Patricia laughing at me. My name is Liz Mosley, and I am going to edit the session today, as you know, probably from the regular names I can see popping up in the participants list. This is our open news meeting where we get to try and source ideas from the people who come along to try and flesh out the beginnings of ideas for news stories, and looking for ways that we might do a particular tortoise treatment, perhaps on a story that is latently existing in the live news agenda, to see if we can do some journalism that is inclusive, that is slow, and that is crucially sort of productive and additive to what we're seeing elsewhere. And as always, I am hugely open to your ideas and suggestions for how we use the hour. I've got two things on my particular list that I want to have a go at today. The second one I think I'm going to come to is schools, and particularly around this notion of catch-up. There are a number of sort of ways of thinking about looking at how we can get school-age kids to, in inverted commas, catch up with learning that they might have missed or lost in the time that schools have been closed, and what's the best way to go about doing that, and is it even really a thing? So I'm going to come to that sort of later on, but I'm going to start, if I can, with the report that was published yesterday by the House of Commons Women and Equalities Committee, which James Wilson, who is in the chat, is going to post a link to for those of you that haven't seen it. And it's part of a series of reports that they've been doing throughout the pandemic about the sort of unequal impacts of both the virus itself and the UK government's response to the virus, and whether that has been sort of completely fairly distributed, whether there have been certain parts of the people in this country who've sort of been clobbered more than others, who've been left behind or overlooked in ways that the sort of government support has been structured and things. And their published report yesterday particularly looked at the gendered impacts of the government response to the pandemic, and it had in it some fairly hair-raising and interesting statistics, findings, and some really robust recommendations for how we can improve the situation, particularly for women. These are things that we have talked about, I have talked about in Thinkings before this year, and things that the sort of women's sector have been shouting and screaming about for a long time, but it has been picked up now. It was on the Today programme this morning, for example, a number of really good pieces from the States actually over the weekend. And I'm really interested to think about how we as Tortoise can pick that up and try to produce something that is meaningful and additive, rather than just sort of sitting back and admiring the problem, which is now sort of fairly well recognised. And I wonder if to open the bidding on those sorts of themes and ideas, and maybe to cover some of the things from the report, I might start with Basha, if she's here. I think she's here. I can spy her name. Are you there, Basha?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Here. Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm fine. It's really snowy where I am.
It hasn't stopped snowing for 3 days.
It's quite
extraordinary.
It's a bit of joy. I'm not complaining about it. It's also really legitimizing the fact that I really don't want to leave the house. It's too cold, and I
absolutely stay in. Hot chocolates all round.
Exactly. Yeah, so I had a look at the report, and I wondered whether it might be useful just to sort of go through some of the headline stats, because I think that it's useful to know where we were before the pandemic, and then you can see, just how bad it is. And I did want to just talk a bit about those articles that came out of America, because I think that they're quite an interesting, they've set quite an interesting standard, because they've tackled something that one of them had a brilliant title, which was I wrote it down somewhere. Basically, that numbers cannot even begin to capture what's happening in many women's lives. So although we can talk about statistics, this is also a much more nuanced, complicated, individual story, and I think that's why it's definitely one for us to try and take on. Anyway, I'll just talk through some of the stats. So before the pandemic, women were doing better in terms of employment than they had done for many years before. So female employment was at 72% at the end of 2019, which is nearly 2 million more women in work than the decade previously. And crucially, it's not just employment, it's what kind of employment. So more women in full-time work than ever before, but still the majority of part-time work is done by women. And we also know that, in addition to part-time work, it's involuntary work, it's temporary contracts and 0 hours contracts, minimum wage jobs are all done by a majority by women. So of course, when the pandemic hit, that was hitting those women the hardest, and particularly women of color and disabled women. So, and if you look at also by sector, what's had to shut down, it's mostly sectors that employ women, so retail, hospitality. And in the US, they've got quite good statistics on this. So 5.4 million women have lost their jobs since the pandemic began, which is more than half of the total job losses. Again, particularly women of color have been hit hard. But in addition to that, 2.1 million women have left the labour force entirely. So they're no longer looking for employment. They're no longer being counted in unemployment statistics. They have just completely disappeared from that market. And that's obviously to do with things like care and childcare, which is a staggering number. We don't have that kind of data yet, or at least I wasn't able to find it when I was looking for it earlier. But we can show here in the UK that the gender gap in childcare has hugely increased. So women are more likely to take on childcare, which isn't necessarily surprising, but that is documented. And the IFS has also found that women are finding it much harder, again, for obvious reasons, to work from home productively when they've got other, children or people to care for. And so the thing that there's a magazine in the US called The Cut, which is a women's magazine. They've done a whole series of articles, really, broad project looking at the cost beyond the numbers. So, beyond the stats, because it's so much more complex than that. Women are more likely to ask for furlough because it's easier for them then to balance home life and work, those sorts of things. So there was just a brilliant line that I pulled out that I just thought I'd read out, which is, what we've lost and all the accompanying grief can't be captured by numbers. It's individual, nuanced, and ever-changing. It will take years for women to fully return to the workforce, likely to lower wages. The damage will be long-term. And so when we're talking about something of that scale, where there are so many individual stories, I was thinking about what as a slow news organization we could do and how would we tell those stories. And I wondered whether, just to sort of start us off, whether we could identify, Liz, I know you've talked about early years, whether it is a particular setting where we could identify 3 women and we will stick with them throughout 2021. Because we did a file on recession 2021 where we tried to, we looked more, I suppose, generationally. I would be curious whether, as a sort of, an exercise in slow journalism, where we attached a reporter to 3 jobs throughout a year, and we saw either women coming in and out of those jobs, or we followed the women themselves, because I think that it has to be something long term if we're going to capture the nuance and also the sort of the particularity of this problem. So that's my bit. That was long, sorry. But
no, it was great. It was really good to get us going. I'm going to come to Tessa in a sec. The thing that I wonder, and Basha might be able to help me with this, the thing that I would really like to try and render, and actually Mandy Reid, she's the leader of the Women's Equality Party, came to the Tortoise COVID inquiry when we had a session particularly trying to nut out some of this stuff. The thing that she said to me that we haven't quite done, and we didn't quite do it in our COVID inquiry write-up, that I thought was really helpful, illuminating, and that actually in the report it does some of it, although obviously it's not a journalistic report, but it starts to do some of it, is to try and sort of map the order of magnitude and the chronology of decisions about specific policies, and use that to try and render somehow this feeling that it's hard not to have about the government response, which is that they just aren't really thinking about women. And you can't write a sort of, you can't do a piece of journalism to say, oh, well, it doesn't seem like women really figure. And, you know, it's a very short sentence to say, well, there aren't really women in the room when the decisions are made. But try and render how that really comes about. And there's a couple of things in the report that sort of begin to suggest how quickly the government have been to either roll back on previous commitments. So very quickly, the requirement to publish your gender pay gap reporting was made non-mandatory for this year. Just like that, switched off, which it wouldn't be the first thing I would think of an employer worrying about having to do at that moment in time. And how quickly things like not extending the £20 increase on universal credit to legacy benefits, what they call legacy benefits, which are types of benefits that haven't yet been rolled into universal credit, that particularly includes benefits for disabled people, disproportionately affects women, how quickly it was said, well, that would be logistically impossible for us to do. And you have to wonder why it is logistically impossible to do that. It sort of feels like it's rather easy to say, oh, well, never mind. Things like how the sort of persistent changes to what was the coronavirus job retention scheme, I think, and then became the job support scheme sort of autumn time, and the chunks that were missing, the chunks of the economy that were missing from those provisions, and in some cases, particularly childminders, and I think au pairs as well, are still missing because they're sort of types of ways of working that don't get either the self-employment thing or the furlough thing, and yet are affected in multiple different ways. And it's not just the role then, it's all the people that depend on the role, you know, all of this stuff. It sort of feels like if we were to try and get a sense of what is treated seriously and with what level of investment and urgency versus what isn't, we might be able to render that sense of women are just left behind. And then the build on it would be, and the report does, it begins to suggest that whether there is a case that some of the decisions have actually been discriminatory in the context of the current law, because that such as the sort of deliberateness. There's some of it which is just sort of careless, some of it's rushing, some of it's, you know, but is it actually discriminatory? And I think some of that detail work hasn't quite been done yet by anybody.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, if we're talking in kind of practical terms about how we would pull this together for the beginnings of a tortoise file or a story, or however we're talking about them now, whether it would be that we need to just commission that piece of data work that looks at all of the sort of pandemic responses in terms of, like you say, the furlough scheme, look at what was rolled back, what was deferred, what support was on offer, you know, I guess cross that against the data that we already had about women in the workforce. But that, I suppose, gets you to the kind of policy end. It doesn't get you to the bit that we know is much harder to capture, which is like the emotional toll that, like, the thing that The Cut did so well was it just interviewed mothers, and 13, well, actually did two separate things. They interviewed 13 women who have left the labour force, and just hearing those stories, because they were all different. It's not, you know, it's not just like, I've got kids to look after. The reasons are so varied, and they're so illuminating about what it's been like for so many people to exist in this pandemic. So I think that would form a part of the file, but I think it's the invisible stuff that's really hard to get to. But I think in combination, you could build a really compelling portrait. I've missed all the stuff that's happening in the chat, and I think there are probably some really good
no, let's go to some people in the chat because there's some good points in there. Let's try Charlotte Wasserman. Are you there? Are you there, Charlotte?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Hiya.
I don't really have much more to add than I said in the chat, but I'm just so glad that you've raised this as an issue, because I feel like it's a sort of invisible story, and really until the report yesterday, it's something that there's been a small amount of noise, but generally kind of then moves on because the conversations are bigger elsewhere. I think for me, I guess the main point is the fact that the data doesn't even exist is pretty telling. Why isn't this getting measured? And I think as a starting point, and I think it would be powerful to try and gather data, but I think you're right, Basha, that it's also about adding a narrative to that. but if you combine those two things, I think there is something that's just been totally ignored, and it's pretty appalling because it does completely reflect government policy. So, you know, it matters, and it's just not being dealt with.
The thing that's, thanks Charlotte, the thing that's frustrating for me when I read this report is that there are a number of people, many of whom have been on Thinkings actually, and that I just sort of know, because if you're a feminist, you're sort of aware of what goes on in the ether. So I know this stuff, you know this stuff. And lots of really good and very clear work has been done throughout, but the lists of supporting organisations, this was produced in a report that was endorsed by, and it's, you know who it's going to be, it's Women's Equality Party, it's the Fawcett Society, it's the Royal College of Midwives, you know the lists, right? But like you say, it doesn't get outside of that women's sector. And you can't help but conclude that it's not just the government doesn't really care that much, but maybe more, why I want to be seeing, it's the Institute of Directors that have endorsed this report about pregnancy and maternity discrimination in the work, but they don't. And I wonder if that's the fault of the women's sector, or is it the fault, how do you kind of get it outside of the bubble, I suppose, is a thing for us to think about. Let's unmute Charlotte so she can respond, sorry.
Two thoughts. I think there's been a lot in the last year about other groups that are perhaps, suffering discrimination, Black Lives Matter, other things that have taken a lot of focus. And actually women's the lived experience of women, which is often intersectional but is also real, has slightly gone down the agenda. I mean, I work in television, and all of the work is about getting more people from diverse backgrounds in, but no one's looking at the fact that women still overwhelmingly leave the industry in their 30s because it's incompatible to do the job and have a family. And I think it's sort of the same with COVID. People feel like women have kind of got equality now, and so the battle, it's easy to ignore it. Perhaps because of that. And I think also women are just too busy and perhaps don't have time to organise themselves. I mean, my friends are all getting up at like 5 a.m. to do 3 hours of work before their kids are up. They're then homeschooling, they're then cooking dinner, they're then working late at night. When do they have time to collectively organise to say, actually, this is really not working for us? So I think that's maybe part of the problem as well.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Let's go to Tessa. Tessa, are you there?
Hi.
Hiya. I know you were always very vocal on the issue of funded childcare, unfunded childcare and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, what can we usefully do on this at this point in time?
Yeah, so I agree, with everything that's been said before, but I sometimes worry that we make this a personal sort of issue. And actually, for me, it's a really simple economic and political issue. So when we're looking at data, there are two things I think we need to frame this against. This isn't just an injustice against women. This is an absolute massive misstep from an economic and political point of view for two reasons. One, if we lose women from the workforce, and as we know, all the stats we mentioned before, they're the first to put their hand up for redundancy, they're the first to go, they're more prone to be on unprotected contracts. If we lose them from the workforce, we are losing years of tax receipts, years of financial independence, years of pension contributions, years of NI contributions. This is not just a personal tragedy. This is an absolutely economic imperative to keep women in the workforce. And the second point is, this idea that somehow having children is a personal decision. It's not. We are living in an aging population where we've got a dwindling replication rate in the population we need, frankly, to breed. And therefore, this is not just an optional extra. We need to create a labour force for the future. So it gets back to, when it comes to data, the thing I'm really interested in is setting this to actually do the maths on treating childcare as part of infrastructure, as it should be. You and I banged on about this enough, Liz. So the maths that I would really like to see, and I remember we talked about it ages ago about someone like the Fawcett Society doing it. I want to see I want to see it really costed out, what the cost of allowing childcare to be paid out of gross income does on the projected revenues from those women who continue to stay in work. And I think one of the challenges with this whole debate is that it straddles a very wide demographic. It straddles people, you know, in service industries on zero contract. It straddles people who are in perceived high paying roles, and therefore it just looks like a middle class tax break. But as you know, sorry, was it Charlotte or Caroline? Sorry, I'm having a bit.
Charlotte.
Charlotte said, you know, the number of women, and we can go around our own sort of friendship groups and see how many women left, so, you know, professional roles in their 30s, because the cost of childcare, or just the sheer sort of nightmare of juggling it all, the hurdle rate of the cost made it sort of unjustifiable. So you know, when we look at board representation in FTSE hundreds, we shouldn't be looking at what's happening at the board level. We need to look at how many women we lose in operational roles with P&L responsibility in their 30s. That's where the problem starts. So I would like to, if we're, you know, if Rishi Sunak's going to be shining his spotlight on tax and rebuilding the economy, I would love to get a jump on what childcare out of gross income looks like, what we could project off the back of that in terms of retaining women, attracting women back to work, retaining them in work, and creating a generation of women who have their financial independence secured.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tessa. I'm going to come to Gertej, if I can, and then I'm going to go to Phoebe. Gertej, you're talking about the beauty industry, which I agree with you. There was a lot of chat in early lockdown about when are we going to open the pubs, and I'm all for opening the pubs, but there wasn't so much focus on when can we go and, you know, have a haircut or a wax or a facial or whatever else, get your nails done. Are you there, Gertej?
Yeah, I am, but
yeah,
I've got a challenge with my camera. So
that's okay. We can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, my wife runs. She's got an aesthetics clinic, and she's quite heavily involved in not just her bit, but actually the beauty sector in general, and the impact. And it's predominantly dominated by women. It's you know, I think I put in the chat, the salons, 82% of the women who either own or work in 82% of their employees in salons are women. The treatment has been absolutely abysmal. I mean, they've not been given clarity about how to approach things. The funding has actually been all over the place. In London, in particularly, it then has an impact on ethnic minority women as well, which is actually even greater. And one of the really interesting things recently was that there was this court case about the business interruption insurance that was involved. And what's come out in the last few days is that Hiscox, which was found again, so has to pay this business interruption insurance, has gone back to the beauty sector in particular and said, well, you know, you weren't specifically named as the group that needed to shut down, so you're actually not going to get any money on the basis of your business interruption, which again, the implications for women is just huge.
Yeah, really fascinating.
And also that sector is much more dependent on physicality. So balancing that against how you deal with children and schools shutting, not being able to go to those places even when they are open, it's huge. And it's $1 billion industry. I mean, it's multi-billion-dollar industry. It's not small.
I wonder if we could do a sort of pound for pound, if you take the beauty industry as almost the archetypal women sector, if you like, dominated by women, largely serving women, and compare it to something of an equivalent size that is a, if you like, an archetypal male sector, and see just how the sort of economic response in particular has been structured. Interesting. I'm going to come back to Phoebe, because again, I've got this sort of half thought about an idea. Weirdly, I was going to write it for one of the quarterly books a while ago for Keith, but didn't for one reason or another. But you're sort of making the point about the economic viability for women your age around this idea of choosing to have a family or not have a family.
Yeah, no, so it was just to like play off Tessa's point, and it's something that we've spoken about before, and I get that, and you know, it's just something that you kind of heard a bit in terms of like the environment. There's like a kind of an argument about having kids and that, but side of it. But I think you know, one of those stupid tweets that was looking at kind of women my age. I'm 24. So out of university, I have a lot of student debt. I did a master's, so I have a lot of student debt. I am renting and unlikely to be able to get out of renting anytime soon. I have, you know, I know people who've really kind of struggled to move in like young professionals who kind of struggle to move up in the tiers. They're kind of sitting on a lower salary. And the conversation I have with my friends is, oh, I couldn't have a kid because I couldn't afford it. And they know full well, and they're very aware of the fact that childcare is expensive. They are aware of the costs around it. They're aware of their career, and they want to get to a better point in their career before they have kids. But there's that always that like time clock, you know, I hate it, but that kind of sits there. And I just, you know, I'm my mum had me at 23, and it was more financially viable to have me at that age than for me now. Like, it just does not seem like a possibility, and I can't see how the pandemic could have made that any better. You know, there's women who've lost their jobs. Many of these women, as we've kind of said, are in hospitality and retail. You know, there's where's the chance for them in the future? They need savings, they need money, they need background, and that's kind of scary to me. And yeah, it's just something I've been thinking about.
Phoebe, this is a curveball, and I'm going to come back to it, I promise, but because I'm allowed to ask questions because I'm in charge today. So one of the things that I was half looking at when Keith approached me and said, will you write the piece on what if women just stop having children? Those of us that have the privilege to be able to choose. Okay, so I understand that that's a subset. And there is data points that are very easily accessible, quick Google search about having a baby, or one less baby if you're planning to have two and you have one, saves this many, you know, tons of carbon emissions or whatever. But I don't know how legit that kind of data is, although I know that sort of it's a bad thing to do for the planet in general. I don't, is that a thing or not a thing? I can't get a grip on that as an argument.
I mean, I think it is in terms of I mean, I've seen those same data points, and I don't know necessarily if that's like where I sit, but you know, like, I don't want to have kids, and my argument for not having kids is I don't want love kids. Like, I have siblings and sisters, and I love them dearly, and I love like my friends who've had kids. I love their kids, but it's that doesn't seem sensible, or it just seems like morally wrong, and I can't really explain why. And I think environment is probably down to it. You know, like, I'm very conscious of that, but it is those data sets, and I think maybe it's that I've seen the wrong data set. Maybe we need to dig into that and just say, like, why do we feel this way? Like, is there science behind it? Because I want to know why. I just, from collectively in my friendship group, I'd say, like, I have many friends who are exactly the same. I don't think it's like an odd thing to say to my friends. So, you know, like, analyze that and see, why are we feeling that way? And yeah, and I can see people in the chat like agreeing as well. So, you know, and it is that just me as a pocket of someone who lives in London and is a young professional, or is it beyond that?
Interesting. We're seeing that there's certainly a sort of a seam of members who are sort of nodding in agreement that this is chiming with them. I'm going to go to Megan. You made a point, Megan, about the introduction of paid maternity leave for cabinet ministers.
Yeah, Suella Braverman is literally about to have a baby, and so I think they have the cabinet has like rushed through this law to allow her to take paid maternity leave, which I just find it absolutely insane that it's taken until 2021 for cabinet ministers to be able to take like paid maternity leave or paternity leave. But I find it insane, but it is unsurprising, because I feel like women haven't really been able to get to a stage where that would be a thing, that they'd need to take maternity leave, because it just wouldn't have been, like, it would have been inaccessible, because they probably wouldn't have been chosen for jobs, because there would have been the concern of, oh, they could be having a baby soon. Because I was speaking to someone about this, and they were like, well, but we've had two female prime ministers, so what do you think about that? And I'm like, well, they were both past the stage of having children when they were prime ministers. So I feel like it's just, it makes me so cross, but I just, yeah, I can't believe it's taken until 2021 for this to be a thing.
Yeah, and by necessity, not just by, obviously you're going to need it. Thank you very much, everybody. There's a few people with their hands up. I'm going to go to Jennifer Allerton. Sorry, Jennifer, you've been sitting there patiently with your little yellow hand up. The hands are suddenly yellow, not blue. That's amazing. I've not noticed it. Hey. Jennifer, are you there? Hiya.
Sorry, my internet's quite patchy.
No, that's okay. It's okay.
Was there a question, or
well, you just had your hand up, so I thought
that's fine. It kind of cut out as you were speaking, so I just wondered. Yeah, it was about So Young Women's Just are currently running a campaign that is based around the fact that women, and young women in particular, because that's the group that they work with, have been severely impacted by the pandemic and everything else around it. And a lot of the problems seem to be when because I'm part of the campaign team, and when your rules or the guidelines, the framework of how to run a campaign, it's focus on one thing. Sorry, am I cutting out?
Slightly. Keep going.
Yeah, sorry. It's to focus on one achievable thing, or one or two achievable things, and drive for that, and hopefully you can get it. When in actual fact, all of the issues are so interlinked, what you need is a larger networked, systematic way of viewing things. So for instance, the issues that came up that women mentioned, the fact that one young woman was fleeing domestic violence and had no recourse to public funds, and that's an issue for a number of women. And then there's mental health issues, there's childcare issues. So it's hard to say, okay, we want the government to achieve this one thing when you're running a campaign, because everything is so interlinked. And what you need is to say, the one thing we want you to do is to see how interlinked these things are, and make a system that recognizes that. So yeah, it's hard trying to put together this campaign at the moment, but yeah. Was sort of...
Thanks, Jennifer. I perhaps should let the boys have a say. Let's go to Andrew Girdwood. Andrew, you've been lively in the chat on a number of things. There was a bit at the beginning when there was a conversation happening in the chat that wasn't what we were talking about on screen. You can talk about that if you want to, or pitch in on the people having babies, not having babies thing, whichever you prefer. I'm pleased you put your hat back on as well. Without a hat for the first time last week. It was almost didn't recognise you.
I think it was in the morning. My hair was still wet. Yes, I've been spamming chat, haven't I? Sorry. I'm child free, so I don't have kids, and I don't have the urge. And I sometimes struggle to understand, if it wasn't for dramatic hormonal mesmerism, why anybody would want kids, for all the reasons we've discussed. But as a child-free person, I have found myself sometimes facing quite a bit of hostility. And I can only imagine, as a white guy, it's not too bad. And if I was a woman, it'd be a lot worse. So I've been called selfish. And there's an argument I concede has some truth to that. And that's the economic one, that we've built a society where we need the next generation to pay our pensions and to look after us. Unfortunately, I'm busy enough in work that I put away money for a private pension. So I'm not even sure there will be a national pension by the time I retire. So maybe I will cut that argument out. But it is a fascinating one. And as we got to in chat, I think simultaneously, it's bad for countries if we're not replicating, if we're not having a young workforce coming in. And that means immigrants are good. I'm not sure I have an answer on should we have kids, are they a privilege or are they a responsibility. I'm not sure I have an answer on anything like that, but it would be quite nice to have a future where we fought for immigrants, when we tried very hard to make our countries as welcoming as possible to lure over the next generation of talent. So maybe there's a hopeful future there.
Thanks, Andrew. Nice to see you as always. I might try and coax Ollie Bothwell on screen. He doesn't very often come on screen, my colleague Ollie. He's one of the talented design team at Tortoise, but I wanted you to just talk through your observation about provision for and uptake of shared parental leave. Ollie, dare you, come on camera. It's always dangerous to see to be active in the chat, just in case I come and he's not going to do it. No. Okay, instead of Olu, I'm just going to take one more comment, if that's okay, on this before we move on to, I'd like to do schools, but maybe in between we'll go to Nico on this thing about visible journalism, which I wasn't going to talk about, but because that's interesting in the chat, we'll do that. Let's take one more comment on the women thing. Yelena, let's go to you, because we tried to have a meeting this morning and then it turned into a non-meeting. So instead, by way of compensation, please do make a comment in Open News. Hi, Yelena.
Privilege in the thinking.
Exactly.
I want to go back to a point that Phoebe was making earlier about women and sustainability. I thought that was really interesting. Last year I made a podcast series about sustainability and intersectionality, and in one of the episodes we focused on women. And I spoke to this fascinating gender scholar called Dr. Connie Russell, and she talked about the connections between socioeconomic and gender privatization and how that plays into our discussion of sustainability. So we talk about how responsibility for sustainability has been so individualized and systematically. You know, we have political and business interests who are trying to shift initiative to the private sphere, saying that we need to stop using plastic straws, or it's all on us to take our bags to the supermarkets, things like that. But when you look at it from a gender perspective, you notice how the private sphere is predominantly occupied by women, and therefore women tend to bear a disproportionate level of responsibility for sustainability more generally, and for enacting these small scale practices, if you will. And it's interesting when you also take a gendered approach to sustainability, because you realize how that limits participation, and it encourages a view of a greener future as something that we achieve through women's work. I can post a link to the podcast in the chat if anyone is interested. I just thought it was a really interesting point about how socioeconomic and gender privatization really intersect when it comes to sustainability.
Really, really interesting. Thanks very much, Yelena. And yes, please do stick a link into the podcast. So we're going to do, as James calls, a handbrake turn now, and I'm going to go to Nico McDonald, although I know there were other people joining in to your sort of opening gambit on viable rather than visible journalism. This is about models of journalism, and you might have spied, some of you who are regulars, that we've got a series of thinkings running at the moment called The Battle for Truth, which looks at the nature and quality of news and news media in particular, but we haven't looked so much at sort of business models, and I think that's what you're getting at here, Nico. Are you there?
Yes.
Hiya.
Hi there. Yeah, I was stimulated by a comment that Barry Weiss, the defenestrated New York Times journalist, well, the last but one to be defenestrated, said in an interview with Megyn Kelly, and she said, "We're living in an age of the challenger to the mainstream, which is little independent, influential people like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Tegby, obviously Megyn Kelly herself." And she says, what really changes the culture is institutions, but you can't ask people to spend £150 subscribing to 15 newsletters and podcasts. And someone made a comment in the chat that I think Daniel, that's the model we have for software as a service these days. We're paying $100, $200 a month for 10 or 15 different services, Zoom being one of them. And similarly with podcasts, we're asked to subscribe to podcasts, pay by Patreon, subscribe to Substack for Suzanne Moore or whichever journalist has had to set up on their own. And is that going to scale? Now, Tortoise has a unique model, which, as James was talking about in Oxford the other day, combines membership, sponsorship, and investment. But I just can't see how journalism is going to be able to scale in this way, because I don't think logistically and financially people are going to be able to pay in the way they are. So and it's maybe it's a discussion to bring to the battle for truth, but I think it is an important one, because it's 26 years since the Telegraph launched ET, electronic telegraph, and we don't seem to have sustainable models for journalism in the way that we did, say, in the early 20th century or the post-war period when ITV franchise was a license to print money, as who was it said? Lord Thompson said. So it's just a sort of general discussion. We've also been discussing cookies and whether that's a viable way of showing that you're a publisher worth advertising with, and so on.
Yeah, funny enough, I've just got my email as just this very second pinged with my Suzanne Moore Substack, although I haven't paid for it, interestingly. I just got it for free out of interest.
No comment. It's
I can see that Katie is on, Katie Vanek-Smith. I don't know if you want to weigh in as the woman who's, I think, rightly credited for the sort of implementation or the idea, the strategy for the paywall. Are you there, Katie? She won't like it because I've just sort of bringing this on her without any warning, but if we're talking about paid for news, she's as good a person as any. Are you there, Katie?
I am, thanks, Liz.
Hello, sorry, I couldn't not come to you for this one, surely.
I was actually just about to private message Nico saying, Nico, this is my specialist subject. We could take a whole year to chat this one through. Look, I think that you're absolutely right, Nico. The 20th century, the connection between the business model and was kind of well formed. And actually the problem with that business model, which was sell for pence, i.e. have a circulation revenue for pence in print, but then have a disconnected value chain between advertising and the reader, i.e. there was never any interest from the journalist, nor needed there to be, between what actually paid the way and what actually sort of delivered the value. And so there was a broken contract in many ways, which is we got used to in the 20th century paid for print and advertising sort of funding the broadcast, not the broadcast media, but the print media, which is where I'm from originally. And that broke with digital, and it broke for two reasons. One, because we published for free, because we thought that was going to be a sustainable model. And obviously it wasn't. And it was very obviously not a sustainable model in the year 2000, where actually cost per thousands of advertising plummeted and continue to plummet over the subsequent years. So it was never going to be. But the reason it happened is because everybody who had run the commercial functions of newspapers came from advertising. So they wanted to believe the hype. So the problem was actually one of our own making and one of our own world. So I actually think I'm a little more optimistic than you, but maybe that's because I'm a tortoise and we're all radical optimists at heart. But I definitely believe that the last 20 years has put right front and center why we need proper business models for sustainable journalism, because the model of having a very wealthy patron, it has its problems, as we know. And actually, you take something like the Times was really never profitable. It just had lots of very wealthy patrons. The only thing that made the Times profitable was the paywall. And in 2013, it turned a profit for the first time in its history. And it's continued to actually sustainably make money from 2013 to now. And that's since being published since 1785. So it's a pretty long time to allow a business model to flourish or build, as it were. But I think you're right. I don't think we're at the end of this story, right? But I think that it's really healthy that there are lots of different sustainable models coming up, from Substack to membership to subscription. The single biggest worry I have, though, but this I think is sort of nuanced by the fact they're called popular titles for a reason, is, how do you make sure that the popular press, the mass market press, the ones that in the Carecross review, sort of like there is a direct correlation between the decline of the press in the UK and less people engaging in news. How do we make sure that the popular press find a business model that can sustain them? And by that, I mean, local news, I think local news has been struggling, but local news should be brilliant at finding community-based revenue streams. It's just that they're can't let go of the legacy that's in them. But local news should totally win, in my opinion, in this new ecosystem. It just hasn't quite got there. The challenge, I think, is popular press, and how do you ensure that the next generation of the Sun and the Mirror and those brands that I think really matter in a democratic society where everybody has access to a free press. For me, those are the business models that are unknown at the moment, and I don't know the answer. And it's not Mail Plus, whoever put that in the chat.
Thank you, Katie. It looks like you have been well and truly nominated to do a sort of proper thinking on this. And I think we might package it up as part of the Battle for Truth. It's definitely related. Like I've just said, in March, which hasn't been announced yet, we're going to do Is Local the Answer as the Battle of Truth. We've still got Is Anything True Anymore coming up later this month. and then the battle to truth. We were going to try and do something about truth in politics, but maybe instead of that, we could look at this sort of business modeling and innovation to sort of engage people in that way. But thank you, Katie. You have now been in the witness of 84 people have said that you agree wholeheartedly and enthusiastically to do that. So thank you for that. Another one in terms of handbrake turn. I'm going to go to my last thing, just because I feel like there is something that we need to talk about in terms of school and catching up. And I'm going to go to Chris Cook for this one, if I can, because he's sort of Mr. Education, resident school person who knows about schools, although not currently at school, I should say. Chris, this thing that I've been reading about, there's been much chat about, which is what's the best method to get school-age children to catch up after presumably falling behind what would otherwise have been expected for them to achieve because schools have been shut and home learning's a nightmare and everything else. And there's a few options have been laid out. Could you just talk us through what the broad options are and what do we mean by catch up and what's the benchmark? How far behind and all of that? I just don't really know if catch up is a myth.
So sorry, apologies for having to wear headphones. My neighbours are doing some drilling through my wall there. So I think you have to go back a step actually, and there's a really good question about why we should be trying to catch up as well, right? So the relationship between education and productivity is really strong, and I think we have a sort of sense of the idea that we don't want to leave a sort of generation of children to be sort of left by the roadside because they've missed critical amounts of schooling. But equally, the relationship isn't that strong, and we should relax a bit, right? So the problem, the really big problem we've got is variation. That is to say that the poorer kids will be more likely to be further behind their peers than they are in a normal year, and they are normally problematically far behind their peers for a range of reasons. And that is the central problem. So I think that's the first thing to focus on. It's about reducing the unwarranted variation between results in education, such that poor kids have a fair shake basically when they start progressing out of education and into other stuff. There's a separate problem with stuff like children leaving the school system and going into either employment or into further or higher education, and the fact that we will get, because we have bad qualifications basically last year and this year, we have sort of lousy GCSEs and A-levels and we can't use them. There'll be people put on the wrong course, and we have another thing, which is that people will be going into those jobs without the normal basis of the normal knowledge base basically that they would normally expect to start. So you have chemists who suddenly discover their undergraduates don't know something about Avogadro's number or whatever that they normally would. The thing is, again, like, these are not huge problems if you are going into a structured environment. So if you're it is kind of easy for chemistry departments to do remedial chemistry courses, right? Just like, it just costs money. Like, and not that much money. We could definitely do it. We could definitely do that in further education, in higher education. For children who are younger, we have time before they leave. So I think I would take the view that the problem is smaller than people think, because actually everyone's in the same boat. People have time. I think the idea that we should be racing to try and make sure that, like, we've caught up by the end of next year is completely nuts. Like, you just have to sort of take things as they come, slowly try and do what we can. One of the reasons I think we should be nervous about trying to do too much is, well, two reasons. The first is there's a lot of stuff that goes on with children, right? Like, they are going through a lot in normal times. Like, being a teenager is deeply stressful anyway. And the idea that they have to make up all this lost time against some ticking clock is unpleasant and probably unnecessary. It will probably, if we try and get back to normality too fast, we'll probably do it in a way that maximizes the variation. So if we basically say we're going to have normal GCSEs again in 18 months time or in a year's time, you will end up with a situation where the kids who had the easiest pandemics are the ones who get all the top grades. So I sort of feel like part of the solution to this is to kind of go quite softly and carefully and be understanding, make sure that we've got progression routes so that people can go into formal education. support those progression routes of the FE and HE and employers with training. There are lots of problems with that. That's quite a big thing for me to just sort of airily announce, but that's a thing. And just kind of like, we've had a pandemic, right? It's okay. like they don't need to be compared to sort of the hypothetical 16-year-old of the mid 1980s. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
And we should just be quite relaxed about it. One of the things I would stress is, if you try to get schools to open over the summer, I keep looking out my window because there's workmen literally out my window. If you try to open schools over the summer, the schools will fall down, right? You'll get mass resignation by teachers. They are all exhausted. We're all exhausted. Teachers are particularly exhausted. And the capacity of the system to just continuously go for months and months and months in addition to their normal term time is nuts. Just not a good idea.
Thank you, Chris. I tend to agree with you about the keeping schools open in the summer. So just to be really clear, this notion that school-age children have to catch up with, I mean, the example you used was a sort of notional 16-year-old in the 1980s, but really we're talking about a notional 16-year-old who would have been sort of now, but 2 years ago kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like there's a gap, a measurable gap where you should have been here and you've only been here because you've been at homeschool and we need to make up that gap. That's a non-concern because in theory, everybody's like that. The gap we should be focusing on is the known and pre-existing gap that's worsened between the people from privileged homes and socioeconomic backgrounds and other people, and that gap has widened. But none of the suggestions that I'm hearing seem to target that gap, the second one I described. They all seem to target this sort of other imaginary gap, keeping schools open for everybody, having more opportunities for tutoring, so having a longer school day where civil society comes and takes up the slack for an extra hour at the end of the day. I'm like, this sounds insane. Is there a sense of, where has anybody got any good ideas about the second gap, the actual more important gap, the one that counts?
So that's sort of easier in a funny way. We've got infrastructure for that, right? So the principle of the pupil premium, for example, is about the idea that there should be extra spending that's targeted at children who are, for a variety of reasons, find it tougher to learn in schools. And we can extend that because, broadly speaking, like poverty is complex and multidimensional, but also they will be the same children, broadly speaking. And like, I would be pretty comfortable about using, say, FSM or some normal poverty measure to start trying to have a go at this. So you can kind of pour into the existing infrastructure a bit to start trying to help with some of this stuff. And we should maybe be looking more, well, my thing is we should really be looking more at that dimension than the race against the hypothetical future, the hypothetical non-pandemic 16-year-old. The brutal truth is the difference between a child who has an A star's worth of knowledge in like GCSE chemistry and an A or B knowledge of chemistry because of the pandemic is not going to have any doors closed to them if we're smart about it. And that lost knowledge is not going to be such that that future training capability can't make it up.
Yeah. Let's take a couple of, I know there's only sort of a few minutes left, but let's take a couple of comments from the chat on this particular subject. Maybe Tanish, you're in a chat with Giles about university teaching, I think. Are you there, Tanish?
Yeah.
Hiya. Oh, hello. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you and nice to see everyone here. I just raised the point Giles was asking about whether like university teachers and students as well, like more particularly university teachers are as stressed. But I know for a fact that one of my lecturers took a break last year and wasn't teaching in term 1, so they had additional difficulties in trying to understand the online learning ecosystem, which I've become used to. And it's just, I can understand the pressure. Like, it's tough for me to speak to a camera when I'm trying to make a video for like 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And if I like to think of the lecturers who are making like content for like, depending from an hour to like 2 hours, I'm sure they're getting fatigued as well. And as someone else also mentioned in the chat, this comes alongside the support measures that they're often extending to students, because we also are really stressed in the pandemic, doing everything online and not having that physical interaction. So it's just a lot of pressure on everyone across the board, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tanis, that's nice to see you as always. Sam Houston, are you there? Hello, Sam Houston, are you able to come on?
I was, yeah, sorry, I wasn't expecting that.
Oh no, that's okay. I'm sorry to sort of jump on you slightly, but I like this comment you're making about the sort of ambient learning gap rather than the have you filled in the learning objective on the form gap.
Yeah, I've got two nieces that are out of school, and they have you know, really been hit quite hard by not being around, just being around friends and things like that. And so it's just everything together, I think, for kids. And yeah, the other point I made, it's just being in school. I you know, my personal memory of being in school, it's not always the things that they're teaching you in the lessons, it's just the things you pick up every day, isn't it? And so I do feel terrible for the kids in this cohort.
Yeah, I'm going to come, thank you, Sam. I'm going to come to Giles for a bit of a last word. Giles, we've talked a lot about schools and universities over the course of the pandemic. I think you have offspring at university, don't you?
Yeah, I don't really deserve the last word. This is not data-led. This is purely impressionistic. But
that's
it's also
okay for thinking. We do impressionistic. That's all good.
It's also based on one Zoom call that was arranged for carers, guardians, parents, and students at this particular university. The level of anger was very high. The disconnect between what the university thought they were doing for students and what students thought was being done on their behalf was very wide. And it's very clear to me, just as a parent, that this particular child of mine is adrift. And I understand there's not really anything anyone can do about it. But the uncharitable part of me does wonder what a tenured academic does with the pandemic. I appreciate that there's an adjustment to be made to recording a lecture rather than giving it live. I don't accept that it's a big or difficult adjustment necessarily. If I was an academic researcher, I'd be seizing the opportunity to go back and read all the books that I'd never got a chance to. There's a massive excuse for relative neglect of my children, my students. I'm deliberately putting it like that rather than in more emollient language, because I think there might be a big problem there that only the students and their parents are really aware of. And by the way, just one last thing, I do accept that in terms of storing up big intractable problems for the future, early years is probably a bigger problem. I accept that.
Yeah.
So all politics is autobiography, and I'm merely speaking from my own experiences.
Thank you, Giles, and we appreciate you doing that. And I can see there are people in the chat who are sort of particularly Lucy Huberman sort of impressing upon us. Obviously there are different scenarios and different people have different types of teachers in universities, have different relationships with their students and requirements and contracts and all the rest of it. So as Giles says, that's his experience and not necessarily a definitive picture. It's 13:59, which means it's time for me to wrap up. I've really enjoyed this lunchtime. Thank you so much to everybody for pitching in and joining in. I hope it was okay. I've got a list of things for us to continue and look into, which is the sign of a good open news meeting. Tessa's thing about looking at the sort of on economic impact of funding childcare out of gross income. I thought Gatej's suggestion for us to really do a proper drill down, perhaps using the beauty industry as a lens to compare sort of women dominated sectors with male dominated sectors and how the government response has reflected that. And somebody else suggested weddings as one to look at in addition to our sort of early years childcare sector. suggestion. I think those are all worth thinking about. Yelena made some really interesting points, and thank you for sharing the link to your podcast, Yelena, about sustainability and children and the intersectionality of those two things. It's sort of a framing that I've not really looked at before. We've got Katie on the hook for doing a viable journalism business models thinking in the future, thanks to Andrew, and a number of other things that I saw whiz past in the chat that I'm sorry we didn't have time to do. How this schools thing is going to play out, I don't know. We'll keep an eye on it very closely. But thank you so much, as always, for joining this lunchtime. Go off and have a sandwich if you haven't had one yet. And we will look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening for Robert and Ghislaine Maxwell and what on earth went on there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.